Pinocchio was released in 1940 by Walt Disney Productions and was their second animated feature film and stars Dick Jones as the voice of Pinocchio, Cliff Edwards as Jiminy Cricket, and Christian Rubb as Geppetto, and is based on the novel The Adventures of Pinocchio by Carlo Collodi and follows Pinocchio, a living puppet who, with the help of Jiminy Cricket as his conscience, must prove himself worthy to become a real boy. This is a really special film for me to talk about on this particular revisit because this just so happened to be one of those films that had a huge impact on my childhood. When I was a kid, there were several Disney films that I would constantly watch on repeat, those being Pinocchio, Bambi, The Rescuers, and Tarzan. I was particularly interested in this film, and it helped me develop a love for the story in general, to the point where I became obsessed with multiple versions of the story, including the musical Geppetto, brought to us by The Wonderful World of Disney, starring Drew Carey as Geppetto, and I was also a big fan of the live-action Adventures of Pinocchio with Jonathan Taylor Thomas and Udo Kier. But Disney's Pinocchio was always my favorite of the adaptations, and with the release of 3 Pinocchio films last year, including the live-action remake of the film we'll be talking about today, it feels like the perfect time to revisit this film. Pinocchio is up there as one of the absolute pinnacles of animation, and I consider it to be one of the greatest animated films ever made, as well as one of the greatest films ever made. And it seems there are many out there that would agree. It's a timeless film based on a timeless story, and I think it improves on every front from what Disney and his team learned during the making of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and surpasses that film by a long shot. Snow White laid the groundwork so that Pinocchio and so many films after it could happen. So with that said, let's do what we always do here and go behind the scenes to see just how this masterpiece was made. Walt Disney first got the idea to make Pinocchio during the production of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs when animator Norman Ferguson brought the 1883 children's novel The Adventures of Pinocchio to Walt Disney's attention. Disney was very enthusiastic about the book and the idea of turning it into an animated feature and commissioned Bianca Majoli, a storyboard artist, to outline the story, but upon reading it, he felt what she had written was too faithful to the original work. It should be noted that Pinocchio was originally intended to be the studio's 3rd animated feature after Bambi, but due to difficulties adapting the story and the animation for the animals, it was announced that Bambi would be postponed in favor of Pinocchio. Adapting Pinocchio proved to be a far different fare when compared to Snow White. For one, the former film was based on a short story that the writers could then expand and pretty much do whatever they wanted, whereas Pinocchio was based on a novel with a very set story told episodically due to its serialized nature. As such, the story went through many changes before reaching the finalized version we have today. One such change involved the character of Pinocchio himself, who is seen as a rude and ungrateful character, and as such, a bit unlikable in the book. So the writers decided to modernize the character a bit, but make him as equally rambunctious as he is in the book. Disney, however, found the character to be too helpless and too often was led astray, and so in 1938, Disney and his story team created the character of Jiminy Cricket, who would help Pinocchio on making the right decision. The character would be inspired by a cricket character from the book, one which Pinocchio ends up killing by squashing it with a mallet. As for the design of the characters, now famed animators Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston were in charge of designing Pinocchio and had his original design fit more closely to the character from the book. It would be Fred Moore who would redesign the character to make him more appealing, but maintain a wooden feel. However, it would be Milt Kahl's design that would be the most influential, as the character became less wooden, and more like a boy with wooden joints. After an animation test with the new design, Disney was so impressed that he urged the writers to involve Pinocchio's personality to reflect the new design. Animation for the film began in January 1938. During production, story artist Joe Grant formed a character model department which designed three-dimensional clay models of the characters, which were given to the staff to observe how the characters would look and be drawn from every angle desired by the artists. They also modeled all of Geppetto's cuckoo clocks and Stromboli's wagon. Due to the difficulty of animating realistic movement, these miniatures were filmed using stop-motion animation. Each form would then be transferred to animation cells, and those cells would then be painted on and overlaid onto background images. Just like with Snow White, live-action footage was shot, but instead of tracing over the actors this time, the animators used the footage to study human movement that they would use in their animation. Overall, Pinocchio was a groundbreaking achievement in effects animation. The effects animators, led by Joshua Mador, focused on the way everything else in the film moves, such as vehicles, machinery, and even natural effects like rain, lightning, smoke, and water. It's thanks to this team that we get the realistic animation for waves and ripples in the water that are present in the third act. As for music for the film, it was composed by Lee Harlan with lyrics by Ned Washington. The song sung by Jiminy Cricket, When You Wish Upon a Star, became a major hit and eventually became a theme song for the Walt Disney Company. The beautiful soundtrack for the film would eventually go on to win Best Original Score as well. When the film was initially released, however, it was not a hit like with Snow White. The film was praised critically and by fans alike, but it was not a box office success, and its returns were below studio expectations. And by late 1940, Disney only recouped about $1 million of the cost for a film that cost nearly twice the amount of Snow White. A lot of the failure of Pinocchio's box office can be attributed to the effects of World War II cutting off the European and Asian markets, but the film would eventually become a success in the following years through multiple re-releases. The film is now seen as a classic and one of Disney's finest achievements, with beautiful animation and timeless music, and has a legacy that will no doubt stand the test of time. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get into my thoughts on the film. Pinocchio is one of the best films ever made, period. Animated or live action. Even with the nostalgia I have for this film, I think it still holds up as a timeless tale with a wonderful story. Characters, catchy music, and some of the best animation ever put to screen. Something I love right off the bat about Pinocchio is how it sets itself apart from what came before. It would have been so easy for Walt Disney and his team of animators to just make more of the same, especially with Snow White being the hit that it was. But something I love so much about this company is how they innovate with each project and give something familiar but wholly new all the same. So watching Pinocchio right after something like Snow White, you should feel right at home. I want to start this review by readdressing a criticism I had with Snow White that's fixed in this film, and that is the story. In that review, I mentioned that Snow White never really feels like a full narrative, but more like a series of shorts strung together to make a feature film. I feel like that is not the case with Pinocchio. It does have a series of events that happen one after the other, but every event feels like it is in service to the larger narrative, and not just the narrative for that particular scene. As such, I think the film has better pacing than what's found in Snow White. The gags also do a great job of servicing the story, whereas they didn't so much in Snow White. I don't mean to keep putting that film down, but I just want to emphasize how much of an improvement Pinocchio was and how it focused so much more on story this time around. That's not to say every gag does this. One of my favorite ones happens to be a scene near the end of the film where Jiminy is underwater and he's stuck in an air bubble and pokes a hole in it, and that bubble begins to fill with water until it pops. It's just very well done and just a nice light gag. The film also manages to balance its tone far better than Snow White with a narrative that is as dark as it is uplifting, and I think maintains that perfect balance throughout its runtime. I think this time around they do such a great job with the characters. Dick Jones as Pinocchio is so likable and exudes that childlike curiosity appropriate for the character, making him one of my favorite protagonists in a Disney film. And I feel like this character truly learns from his lessons throughout the film, which is a huge problem I had with 2022's live-action remake, which was all around just too afraid to get its hands dirty. However, I think the real star of the film is definitely Jiminy Cricket, who has since become an iconic character in the Disney brand. This character is wise, funny, and pretty relatable as well, and is perfect at playing our entry point into the story. I also have to briefly mention other characters that leave lasting impressions, such as Stromboli, who is this towering and menacing figure in the film, and is probably the closest the film gets to having an actual antagonist. But one of my favorite characters has to be the fox himself, Honest John, who is just a great foil for Pinocchio. He's a swindler and knows his way around a conversation and gets the naive Pinocchio into some really terrible situations. He's eccentric and really funny. Then you have softer performances such as Evelyn Venable as the Blue Fairy, who is both beautiful and wise and gives us the story's inciting incident and sets both Pinocchio and Jiminy on their way. It also needs to be mentioned just how good the animation is in this film, from the gorgeous backgrounds to the fluent animation. As mentioned in my behind the scenes for this film, the animators were using techniques they had never tried before, and you end up seeing all these little details in the way characters or objects move or how the environment reacts. A prime example of how good the animation was, and it's still insane to me that it ended up looking so good, is the water, and particularly the waves and how they move and crash and bubble. It's just so much more technologically advanced than what they were already doing in Snow White. And it's instances like this why I think these early animated films hold up so well. They have stood the test of time. We even get this amazing zoom in and dolly shot where it's as if we have a camera pushing into the small town and then moving across the houses. It's just unbelievable what they were able to accomplish in this film. The tone is also so perfectly set for this film. If I'm being honest, this is one of the scariest Disney films, from its subject matter all the way down to its imagery. We of course have the character of Stromboli, who locks Pinocchio in a cage and says that he might end up using him for firewood. Pinocchio basically becomes a slave to him. Then we see Pinocchio being taken by the coach driver and taken to Pleasure Island, where all the boys are turned into donkeys and sent to the salt mines. Do I even have to explain Lampwig's transformation into a donkey, which is first shown through funny gags like him getting a tail or his head turning into a donkey's head, but it soon takes a dark turn as we see him begging for help and his hands transform into hooves and his silhouette slowly turns into a full-on donkey. It's horrifying stuff, and I'm surprised I really wasn't fazed by this stuff as a kid. And much like with Snow White, I think Disney and company killed it when it comes to the beginnings and endings of these two films. Pinocchio's first act is so simple, mainly taking place in Geppetto's shop. We get everything we could possibly need to understand these characters. We get Geppetto's wants, Pinocchio's wants, and Jiminy's as well. We also get the mesmerizing entrance of the Blue Fairy, which I never realized until this most recent rewatch that you can actually see right through her. Like, she's a ghostly figure. Then you have this third act with Pinocchio trying to find his father and attempting an escape from the whale monstro. The chase scene is super intense, and I tell you, there's nothing more terrifying than the moment where Jiminy finds Pinocchio lying face down in the water as if he were dead. However, that is soon subsided with yet another similar yet stellar ending, where Pinocchio finally proves himself to be good and unselfish and gets to become a real boy. It's a perfect ending to a perfect film, and even though it's pretty much the same ending as Snow White, it feels more personal because Pinocchio truly ends up feeling like a well-rounded character. It would also be a complete disservice to this film if I didn't at least mention the music for it. I think this is truly a masterful work. The soundtrack and the songs themselves give us the wonder, the emotion, and the happiness this film exudes. The songs are also all incredibly memorable. And I think When You Wish Upon a Star is one of the greatest songs ever written for a film. And it's no wonder the song would go on to win an Academy Award along with the soundtrack and become Walt Disney Studios' anthem in the future. Guys, I love this film. This is about as perfect as you can get. Walt Disney and Company took everything they learned from Snow White and applied it to this film and made what I consider to be one of the greatest films ever made. The film might not be for everyone that's looking for something a bit more modern and fast-paced, but I don't think it can be denied the sheer talent on display in this film. It truly is one of the best of the best. So, with all that said, I'm going to give Pinocchio a 9 out of 10. I want to thank everyone once again for checking out this revisit of Pinocchio. I was really excited to get to this one and give it the review I think it deserves. But what do you think of Pinocchio? Let me know in the comments section below, and as always, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and stay positive.